For 1,000 years, the efreeti, Kaz Gal, has been a prisoner in the magma chamber deep beneath Mount Vesuvia. Trapped there by the fire goddess Lynnyth, Kaz Gal held court before a motley crew of fire and steam efreets and magmans. Kaz Gal bemoaned his captivity while torturing his retinue with cruel tricks. Kaz Gal had dared defy Lynnyth those 1,000 years ago by using the then active crater to find human slaves among the populace of Vesuvia. So she had created a great lava seal that held him within the magma chamber, bound by powerful spells and guarded by azers, to whom Lynnyth had given control of the vast networks of caves that once Kaz Gal ruled. Meanwhile, below, the village of Vesuvia grew to a great city, prospering from the thermal baths and from the lava soil as Kaz Gal brooded in his prison. There seemed no escape until one day, a salamander named Shezzal appeared suddenly before Kaz Gal. So surprised was the efreeti that for once in his long life he was speechless. How could this lowly salamander have made its way into this prison? Shezzal smiled and said that he and he alone had deciphered the runes that covered the Great Seal and could move back and forth at will. And he could free Kaz Gal at last for a price. Kaz Gal warned the salamander to take care. He might just as easily keep him here as his prisoner, tormenting him as he did to so many of the salamander's ancestors. Shezzal merely smiled, and he offered up this bargain. All he wanted was that Kaz Gal would slay the azers and give over the treasure they had accumulated. Kaz Gal would be free from his prison and able to take his revenge on the people of Vesuvia below, and then be free to go back to the elemental plane of fire. But Shezzal warned Kaz Gal, no amount of torture will give up my secret. And if you slay me, then it'll be at least 1,000 more years before you escape. Kaz Gal thought on this for a moment, then gave his assent and made his bargain, and followed Shezzal to the Great Seal. Shezzal reached forward to the runes and began to move them on the block into different positions, and the earth began to rumble around. He did this for over 3 days, and the rumbling continued. The activity from far below began to move the chamber back and forth. And finally, the rumbling and shaking grew so intense that the Great Seal broke asunder, sending the magma up through the volcano's central shaft and outside the crater. And so it was that Mount Vesuvia, after 1,000 years of being dormant, once again came to life and rained death down below the people of Vesuvia. Hello again, folks. KR King here, helping you homebrew your own D&D campaign. So in that rather lengthy intro, I gave you the story of the eruption of Mount Vesuvia, the same story that I had started my video last weekend. But the first story was from the perspective of the townspeople of Vesuvia, and also it was sort of historical. Yes, they were worshiping Lynnyth and they were praying, but this happens all the time in the real world. It was very much a description of an eruption that could occur at any time in history. Because as modern listeners, we understand plate tectonics and how it works and why volcanoes erupt. But the second version is in the style of D&D, in which all of the activities within the volcano are from the desires and motivations of sentient creatures. So this creates both the means for the volcano's dormancy, the imprisonment of the efreeti Kaz Gal, and the method by which the volcano itself erupts. The salamander coming has solved the riddle of the runes and is able to break the seal, hence throw up the magma. And this points to a fundamental aspect of the world of D&D, in which the mythological explanations and worldview that once, for most of human history held sway, is in fact the actual world. Because people used to think that there were witches and warlocks that could throw spells, that inanimate objects had souls, and that natural phenomenon such as floods or famines or, yes, volcanic eruptions were manifestations of supernatural forces. So instead of a scientific view of the world, which is impersonal and relies on the laws of physics, you have a personal view of the world, by which the events of the world are determined by the agency of very powerful creatures, gods, and by which there are no fast and true laws of physics. And this is important because in science fiction, you always adhere to the laws of physics and mechanics. Wherever you are in the universe, they apply. And whatever sort of devices and things, whether it's warp drive or matter transmitters or something, it should make sense in terms of those laws. But in fantasy, you don't have to worry about the laws of physics. You have magic energy which somehow infuses the world. You have all sorts of creatures that could not exist, that have all sorts of abilities and whatnot. You are bending the rules of physics all the time. Now, usually you want the material plane, where the majority of the action of your world takes place, to adhere fairly closely to the laws and rules of the real world, because in order to have settlements and civilizations and people operating, family structures, whatever, it should have some adherence just so it all makes sense. But you have other planes where none of these rules apply. So when you're thinking about what sort of creatures and storylines and encounters you're going to have in a geographical and geological area like a volcano, what you want to think about are the fantastical mythological explanations for how that volcano came to be. And volcanoes are a rich environment because so many creatures in D&D are fire-based or fire-resistant. Notice in my opening explanation, I used a whole host. I had an efreeti, salamanders, mythics, I had azers, the magma, and I had this magic seal which held the magma in a chamber, but then once broken, it took only 3 days, and boom, you have an explosion. It would probably take a lot longer in the real world. Now, what I didn't do in either example was insert the players, right? Where are they in relation to this 3-day period when the volcano goes? Do they hear about it? Do they see it from a distance? Are they just happen to be visiting Vesuvia for some reason? And if they are there, what do they do? Do they run as fast as they can, or do they investigate, or are they asked to help out? Now, you as the GM, you want them perhaps to investigate, but you got to let them do what they want to do. You create an adventure hook. And again, maybe you extend this to more than 3 days. Maybe you create some storyline that draws them to the volcano. Perhaps an azer detects what's going on behind the seal, which takes longer than 3 days. They contact someone, they come forth, maybe some townsperson or whatever, and they go forth and, trying to get some help. The point is, the action is coming from the magical creatures which are part of this geological phenomenon. And what you want to do is you want to think about the creation stories that have occurred in the real world in mythological times. So I mentioned Crater Lake in the previous episode where I just happened to visit. The Klamath Indians of the area were around 7,000 years ago when there was this catastrophic explosion. Mount Vesuvia exploded, huge eruption, then collapsed in on itself and eventually created Crater Lake. So what did the Klamath Indians? They described two gods, Skell of the above world and Lao of the below world. And Lao fell in love with the daughter of a Klamath chieftain, but she refused him. She found him ugly because he was from the below world, and he got really mad and he threatened to wipe them out with fire. So Skell got involved. They had this climactic battle, which ended in Lao's defeat. The mountain collapsed, and Lao was sent back to the below ground forever. So what you want to do is think of an origin story in a similar way for your, say, let's say a Crater Lake. So you have your classic, subterranean race. Let's say the dwarves who dig too deep, go somewhere they shouldn't, and they get in trouble. There's going to be this massive eruption. Their civilization is going to be wiped out. They pray to Modron, let's say. And Modron saves them, creates this Crater Lake. But because they disobeyed him, Modron makes them, they live in this underwater city in this lake. They can never leave. Again, I don't know what underwater dwarves would be like. I'm just throwing these ideas out there. You'd have to work this out. But it's the classic tale. Because whenever the gods get involved, they always do things with a twist. The dwarves were greedy. They get to keep their halls, but underwater forever. And so then you have the players get involved in this Crater Lake. Maybe there's a Romeo and Juliet. Let's say that there's a young underwater dwarf and he sees some villager. He likes her, but he can't leave the water. She's been told not to go too near the water. There's legends about the creatures that live far beneath, but he leaves a valuable gem for her. And, you could throw in a terrible creature, since Crater Lakes are so huge, maybe a kraken or dragon turtle, something that was put there to keep both the dwarves, the underwater dwarves, in their place, but also to prevent people from going into the water. And this makes sense how a giant creature like this could get into this isolated lake when there's no connection to any outside water source. And perhaps the father takes this gem into town, the player's town, to try to sell it. They hear about this and wonder, maybe there's more fantastical gems. And again, I'm just coming up with this off the top of my head. It needs to be fleshed out. But you get the idea. You have an origin story that's based in the mythological, magical world of D&D, and then you have a plot hook that gets the players involved. Because your origin story and the things around it don't have to make geological sense in terms of tectonic plates and laws of physics. It's the desires and the motivations of magical creatures. Now, the interesting thing here is you have the classic opportunity for an underwater adventure. The players come, maybe at the lake. They realize there's something going on here. You know, 5th edition isn't the best for underwater adventures. To me, maybe I've missed something. I see, you have this water breed that can do a group 24 hours, but you need freedom of movement. And also, they don't give you an idea of what spells work or don't. Hey, maybe that's an idea for a future video. Another thing to remember is active volcanoes don't have to erupt every time the players go by them. This is going to seem very contrived and obvious. And they can provide a really good environment just being active. Because if a volcano contains something that's interesting to the players, maybe again precious gems, or there's an old mine, maybe there's a ruined temple on the slopes where they've heard about some great treasure or something interesting, you've just got this extra threat of eruption, of lava, of steam vents, or it just makes the environment in there more dangerous. Do you always have a red dragon living in an active volcano? No, even though in the old days we used to do that. The other thing about an active volcano is it serves as a crossroads between the material plane and others. I mean, the elemental plane of fire is obvious, but you've also got the various planes of hell, limbo or something. And again, how would creatures react to this? Would there be sort of a truce here among very powerful creatures that they can go back and forth, but not lesser creatures? So the final question, of course, is when you're trying to run an adventure with players and there's an erupting volcano. So I think 3 questions arise in terms of this. How long is it going to take before the volcano erupts? Can it or should it be stopped? And how deadly is the eruption? So time is going to start obviously for the players when they arrive at the volcano, but they're going to find out, how long has this been going on? Has this ever happened before? Is it dormant and suddenly now it's for the first time in 1,000 years, or is it a regular thing and they have an idea of what this time frame is like? And if there is an opportunity for the players to stop this, can they determine, what this process would mean? Because of course in real life, volcanic eruptions cannot be stopped, but in D&D, when they're, induced by some activity like the efreeti breaking the seal, they can be stopped. So in my example, if the efreeti is trying to break this seal, is there some way that the players can find this out? Something the azers know? Is there some prophecy, some legend? You do have divine intervention in terms of asking woe or wheels kind of questions. If they determine this, what can they do to prevent it? And of course, in a volcanic eruption, you may not want to stop it. It may be there to free some creature, a good creature that's being held, or there's just some regular purpose, in terms of letting off pressure. If you try to stop this now, it's only going to build up and be worse. So then the player's mission becomes to save the townspeople. And even if the players are going to allow a volcano to erupt, they're going to get the townspeople to safety, you could put a treasure or some incentive for them to get there just before and get out. And obviously, if it's a slow moving with lava flows, the Hawaiian style, they have to avoid these, not get cut off. And if it's a Krakatoa, Mount St. Helens, massive explosion, then they have to, they're really against the clock. All right, so you've thought about your origin story as to how the volcano came to be, what creatures are there, what are they doing there, and if it's erupting, why, and how long. The last thing is the effects of the eruption. We know what happens when a volcano blows its top, it's death and destruction, but how about in that period leading up to the eruption? There is a great book called The Day the World Ended, which is about the eruption in 1902 of Mount Pele in the Caribbean. 30,000 people died in this town. In fact, only like 6 survived. I'll put a link below for this book if you're really interested in running a volcano, because it gives great information on the things that happened leading up to an eruption. You've got mudslides, you've got steam vents appearing, in locations they've never been. You have pumice boulders that fly out of the crater and land. Some of them are as big as houses. And you have throngs of animals that start running out of the jungle or the hillsides to escape, because they are very sensitive to the tremors. So you had swarms of snakes or giant centipedes. And the thing is, that's the stuff that really happened back in 1902, and it's very adaptable to D&D. And if you use these kind of threats, both the physical in terms of the boulders or the steam vents, or the natural in terms of the fauna reacting as your players are heading up the mountain slope to do whatever it is they want to do, whether it's to stop the eruption, find something or whatever, it's going to add some verisimilitude to your players. You've really looked into this. You've really made them feel like they really are going up the slopes of an erupting volcano. So if you like what you've seen, please subscribe to my channel. I'm always looking for more. Leave some comments because I love to get them and I always answer them. But most importantly, keep playing D&D. Tell somebody else about it.